Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 76. And I'm recording this today on September 11th, 2023, 22 years after the terrorist attacks at the World Trade Center. We are joined, of course, today by our regular co-host, or semi-regular co-host, Tom Libby. Hello, Tom. How you doing?
Hey, everyone. I'm doing exceptionally well. Thank you.
And we are going to read our book today, following along with our month of focusing on what leaders can learn from fantasy and science fiction novels. And you'll be able to see it on the video. The Clarion Books edition of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. It is the first part, as you know, of the most influential three-part trilogy of fantasy novels in our modern and, dare I say, going into our postmodern era. And it is, in essence, a follow-up to the prequel that we recorded in episode number 75, which you should have listened to with our co-host there, Ryan Stout, The Hobbit. So we are going to talk about the Fellowship of the Ring. We are going to talk about the meaning of the Lord of the Rings. And of course, we are going to talk about living in the backwash of the Lord of the Rings films, which I believe, because they were so successful in the early 21st century, I believe that because they were so financially successful for New Line Cinema, they paved the way for the MCU, for Star Wars, and for everything else that has come after in our long 20-year Twilight struggle to actually tell stories for adults based on what are, quite frankly, sometimes just kids' stories. Although not Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien, and we'll talk a little bit about Tolkien today too, didn't really write this version like he did The Hobbit for kids. As we do always, we're going to go to the book. So, reading from the Clarion Books version of The Lord of the Rings, going to start in Chapter 2, Book 1, The Shadow of the Past. How long have you known this? Asked Frodo at length, and how much did Bilbo know? Bilbo knew no more than he told you, I am sure, said Gandalf. He would certainly never have passed on to you anything that he thought would be a danger, even though I promised to look after you. He thought the ring was very beautiful and very useful at need, and if anything was wrong or queer, it was himself. He said that it was growing on his mind, and he was always worrying about it. But he did not suspect that the ring itself was to blame. Though he had found out that the thing needed looking after, it did not seem always of the same size or weight. It shrank or expanded in an odd way and might suddenly slip off a finger where it had been tight. Yes, he warned me of that in his last letter, said Frodo, so I have always kept it on its chain. Very wise, said Gandalf. But as for his long life, Bilbo never connected it with the ring at all. He took all the credit for that to himself and was very proud of it, though he was getting restless and uneasy, thin and stretched, he said, a sign that the ring was getting control. How long have you known all this? Asked Frodo again. Known? Said Gandalf. I've known much that only the wise know, Frodo. But if you mean known about this ring, well, I still do not know, one might say. There is a last test to make, but I no longer doubt my guess. When did I first begin to guess? He mused, searching back on memory. Let me see. It was in the year that the White Council drove the Dark Power from Mirkwood, just before the Battle of the Five Armies, that Bilbo found his ring. A shadow fell on my heart then, though I did not know yet what I feared. I wondered often how Gollum came by a great ring. As plainly as it was, that at least was clear from the very first. Then I heard Bilbo's strange story of how he had won it, and I could not believe it. When I at last got the truth out of him, I saw at once that he had been trying to put his claim to the ring beyond doubt, much like Gollum with his birthday present. The lies were too much alike for my comfort. Clearly, the ring had an unwholesome power that set to work on its keeper at once. That was the first real warning I had that all was not well. I told Bilbo often that such rings were better left unused, but he resented it and soon got angry. There was little else that I could do. I could not take it from him without doing greater harm, and I had no right to do so anyway. I could only watch and wait. I might perhaps have consulted Saruman the White, but something always held me back. Who is he? Asked Frodo. I've never heard of him before. Maybe not, answered Gandalf. Hobbits are or were no concern of his, yet he is among the wise. He is the chief of my order and the head of the council. His knowledge is deep, but his pride has grown with it, and he takes ill any meddling. The lore of the Elven rings, great and small, is his province. He has long studied it, seeking the lost secrets of their making, but when the rings were debated in the council, all that he would reveal to us of his ring lore told against my fears, so my doubts slept, but uneasily. Still I watched and I waited. All seemed well with Bilbo, and the years passed. Yes, they passed, and they seemed not to touch him. He showed no signs of age. The shadow fell on me again, but I said to myself, after all, he comes from a long-lived family on his mother's side. There's time yet. Wait. And I waited until that night when he left his house. He said and did many things that filled me with fear that no words of Saruman could allay. I knew at last that something dark and deadly was at work, and I have spent most of the years since then in finding the truth of it. There wasn't any permanent harm done, was there? Asked Frodo anxiously. He could get all right in time, wouldn't he? Be able to rest in peace, I mean? He felt better at once, said Gandalf, but there is only one power in this world that knows all about the rings and their effects, and as far as I know, there is no power in the world that knows all about the hobbits. Among the wise, I am the only one that goes in for hobbit lore, an obscure branch of knowledge, but full of surprises. Soft as butter they can be, and yet sometimes as tough as old tree roots. I think it is likely that some would resist the ring far longer than most of the wise would believe. I don't think you need to worry about Bilbo. And then jumping ahead a moment, Frodo took it from his breeches pocket, where it was clasped to a chain that hung from his belt. He unfastened it and handed it slowly to the wizard. It felt suddenly very heavy, as if either it or Frodo himself was in some way reluctant for Gandalf to touch it. Gandalf held it up. It looked to be made of pure and solid gold. Can you see any markings on it? He asked. No, said Frodo, there are none. It is quite plain, and it never shows sign of scratch or wear. Well, then look. To Frodo's astonishment and distress, the wizard threw it suddenly in the middle of a glowing corner of a fire. Frodo gave a cry and groped for the tongs, but Gandalf held him back. Wait, he said in a commanding voice, giving Frodo a quick look from under his bristling brows. No apparent change came over the ring. After a while, Gandalf got up, closed the shutters outside the window, and drew the curtains. The room became dark and silent, though the clack of Sam's shears, now nearer to the windows, could still be heard faintly from the garden. For a moment, the wizard stood looking at the fire. Then he stooped and removed the ring from the hearth with the tongs, and at once picked it up. Frodo gasped. It is quite cool, said Gandalf. Take it. Frodo received it in his shrinking palm. It seemed to have become thicker and heavier than ever. Hold it up, said Gandalf, and look closely. As Frodo did so, he now saw fine lines, finer than the finest pen strokes, running along the ring, outside and inside, lines of fire that seemed to form the letters of a flowing script. They shone piercingly bright, and yet remote, as if out of a great depth. I cannot read the fiery letters, said Frodo in a quavering voice. No, said Gandalf, but I can. The letters are Elvish, of an ancient mode, but the language is that of Mordor, which I will not utter here. But this is the common tongue, is what is said. Close enough. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. It is only 2 lines of a verse, long known in elven lore. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. And with that, you'll remember from the movie, we're off to the races. When you think about fantasy novels in the 21st century, I don't care if you're the guy who wrote Game of Thrones and can't finish it. Or if you're the HBO showrunners who jealously look at everything that New Line Cinema put together and try to replicate it with Game of Thrones and then finish it badly, we're all doing copies of copies of copies of The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien loved language. He loved allegory, even though he claimed he didn't. He loved myth and lore, but he was particularly fond of world building. And this is one of the bigger things that you see with Lord of the Rings. Now, let's talk about the ring for just a moment. Because the ring is it's the MacGuffin, such as it were. This were filmed war. It's the Maltese Falcon. It's the stuff that dreams are made of, right? The ring is small, but the evil wrapped inside of it is large. And Tolkien, who was a Catholic and a Christian, actually, sorry, not a Catholic, that was C.S. Lewis, who was a Christian, was very much concerned about where the devil lay in society and culture, particularly trying to put together the trauma of experiencing World War I. All of the Lord of the Rings trilogy is basically about him dealing with World War I for his entire life. And the evil of World War I did not lie in large troop movements or even in big battles like the Somme, where J.R.R. Tolkien served. It lay in the small turnings. It lay in the undecipherable and sometimes the unrecognizable things. It also lay in the dynamics between large systems and institutions of power, represented in The Lord of the Rings by Saruman and others, and the hobbits. You know, the boring, uninteresting people who eat second breakfasts and don't really matter too much.
Those are my kind of people.
They're my kind of people too. And so we're going to talk about all of this today. We're going to unwrap the Fellowship of the Ring. And I don't know that I'm going to say anything, or Tom and I are going to say anything today here that's going to be really that groundbreaking, because a lot of things have been said about this trilogy. I just want to add my 2 cents to the pile, as I'm sure Tom wants to add his 2 cents to the pile. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, Tom watched the movie instead of reading the book, because the book is thick, and he's not wrong. It is a big book. The Two Towers is a little bit shorter, and then Return of the King is the shortest book. However, the movies were epic, and we can talk about those as well. But Tom, tell us a little bit about your impressions of The Lord of the Rings.
Well, before I do that, I'd like to also add that, so I think you're 100% right that there's so many adaptations of this, right? And some of the more recent, Game of Thrones, The Witcher. The Witcher is another version of this that is wildly popular right now. And the funny part is, I see, and I never made the connection to the whole World War II thing, but it's kind of a little eye-opening for me, right? Because if you think about like all the evilness, of course he's thinking that, the German. But I think one thing to your point that I like is that the evilness was in the subtleties. It was the small stuff. It wasn't Normandy or like all these big battles that we think of. That wasn't that.
You mean World War I? He was not in World War II.
Oh, he was in World War. He was in World War I. I'm sorry. So, yeah. but again, the rules, the thought process still applies. Normandy was in World War II. I apologize, but the idea behind it's that subtle thought process of power consumption that makes it evil. It's not, because if you think about it, if we were fighting wars for the true betterment of mankind, there's no evil to that. But there's never been a war that's been fought for that reason.
No.
We don't fight wars to make things better. We fight war because somebody wants more power than somebody else, and that's
old men send young men to die in wars because of personal greed, greed, antipathy, lust for power, hatred, hurt feelings. Hurt feelings is a big one, and And yeah, you send thousands of young men to die. And Tolkien, along with his buddy C.S. Lewis, experienced this sort of abattoir of death and had to make sense of this.
Yeah.
And the thing is, we live in the post era of World War One. And I said this when we were talking about The Hobbit, but it's worthwhile to make this point here as well. Even modern wars, like the war that we just got out of in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's the United States in 2020, whatever, right? That 20 years we spent, we just mentioned September 11th, that 20 years we spent mucking around in the Middle East, that my generation spent fighting in the Middle East.
Yeah.
I said when that war started, well, I guess we're going to clean up for the Ottoman Empire now again. Well, the Ottoman Empire fell apart in World War One.
Yeah.
All fell apart because of the Arab Revolt and T. Lawrence and World War One. And the Germans, well, not the Germans, but the French and the English just cut the Middle East up, set up all these artificial boundaries. And now guess what? 100 and some odd years later, we got to go back in and fix all that crap again.
Yeah, right.
But it's never the large things. It's the small.
That's right. It's always, yeah, exactly. The funny part though is like, so, in fairness, and you were not incorrect. I did not go read the book this weekend because you sent me the script for this podcast on Friday. I was not reading this book over the course of a couple of days, but I will also.
I also have one leg up on you because I've read this book like 4 or 5 times, so I also have one leg up on you. Like, all right. I know the material very well.
But so let's look at the film for a second, just because
let's look at the film.
We're both movie guys, right? Wow, what amazing, right? Like the cinematography, the landscapes, the alteration of certain aerial views that made certain areas of countries look like it was a different world. I mean, they really did a nice job with this, and the acting was very well done. Like this is not like. And if you think about it, because Lord of the Rings, this is early 2000s, right? I don't remember the exact year it came out, but the CGI stuff was just starting to get that crispness and really good. So, like the guy who played Gollum, the guy who wore the green suit, he was amazing.
Andy Serkis.
Yeah, Andy Serkis. He was awesome, and he didn't even have like you couldn't even tell it was him, right? Like, but just the movements and the shadowing and all this other stuff. They just I think they took what Tolkien wrote and did a really nice job with the interpretation of it, because that's essentially what we try to do with movies, right? Where like it's an interpretation, and you have artistic liberties and artistic freedoms to read something and interpret it in your brain what it visually looks like. And a lot of times people like you and I watch movies and we go, that's not what I saw in the book. Like I read that book, that didn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. Lord of the Flies was a good one. Like when I read that book and I watched that movie, I just scratched my head, but anyway, but I didn't do that with this with this one, right? Like I thought they did a really nice job, like giving you visual understanding of the writing.
So Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, the first film, according to IMDb, because I'm going to have people just yelling at me if I don't get this, it came out in 2001.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. December 19th, 2001. So 4 months after September 11th. And I got to admit, when I heard they were doing it, I thought, this isn't going to work. There's no way in hell this is going to work. It's number one, the books are too complicated. Number two, the lore is too deep. And number three, just like we saw with Amazon recently with the Rings of Power nonsense that they tried, if you go and muck with the source material too much, the people who are deep into this, and there are people who their lives are driven by this.
Yeah.
I have some of those people in my family. I'm not going to get into it. But their lives are driven by knowing the minutia in the Silmarillion. Regular people don't know the Silmarillion. And these people, they will destroy Jeff Bezos if he tries to destroy that thing, as we've already recently seen. They're not standing for nothing. They're not like the Star Wars people. They're not like the MCU people. They're not just sort of taking it. No.
Oh, no, they're way beyond those guys.
They're way beyond those guys. Yeah.
My youngest son's one of those people, by the way. So go ahead.
Yeah, there you go. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. And Peter Jackson was the type of director who actually loves the books. He loves the source material, and that's what you saw come through in the film. Everything was treated so lovingly. I mean, the details on the chainmail, like he nailed everything. Like, and that because, and we'll talk a little bit more about this today, but in Tolkien loved world building, and he was a student of, not a student of, but also a master of philology, which is basically the study of languages. And so for him, and there's a Christian thing here too, which I'll leave that to the side for just a second. We can go there in a little bit, but for him, the words, all creation begins with the word, basically. And if you understand the words, you understand Elvish language, then you can build a whole bunch of other things out from that, right? Or if you understand the Dwarves language, and you could build a whole bunch of other things out from that. And he took it to its logical end with multiple revisions, by the way, and reprintings and people mucking with his text. There were editors and printers who literally mucked with this guy's text and like changed word spellings and changed around sentences. And he was constantly going in and revising on multiple printings when this book initially came out. So, because it was about those small things. The ring is a MacGuffin. This is my last question for you. So it's you don't really need the ring, but it physically grounds you in the world. I know people who have the prop of the ring in their house. Like, why would you
tempt fate? Like,
it seems like a step too far. But these are also the same people who will, like, dress up as Frodo or whatever, or Samwise and go to a anyway, they'll go do stuff. I'm sure you've run into those people before as well, in your time. The ring itself, the One Ring. Why do you think Tolkien went with a ring? And I've never really heard an explanation for that. And I don't think he gave one. I think it was just a thing. But why a ring? What does a ring symbolize? Because it's more than just a MacGuffin, I guess. It's a symbol of something else. Go ahead.
Well, the only thing I could think of, and I'm just, so those of you who have listened to this and heard this, you heard us, me as a guest in your podcast, know some of my background. So, and I'm not suggesting Tolkien looked at the Native American belief systems, but I do think there's some worldwide generalities that happen around certain things. For example, a circle in general, right? There's no beginning, no end. So I think there's some sense of what's the word I'm thinking there? Symbolism there, right? Mm-hmm. The circle, it has no beginning, no end. The other thing is it goes on the hand, on the left hand, that is directly linked to the heart. So it can actually, so there's not a lot, like, what else do you put on that's so intrinsic in that value, where you think even back then the institute of marriage was looked at as so deep and so, like, I don't want to use the word perfect, but as close to a perfect union as you could think of, right? So that ring symbolized the union of your heart and soul, so to speak. So I think there's two things, pieces of symbolism there, that I think that people just kind of skip over, right? Like the thought of a circle being no beginning, no end. It's continual. It's lifelong. There's no way to stop motion from the circle, right? So in Tolkien's thought process, that story could have went on forever, because there's no winner or loser. It's just because the battles of good versus evil are going to continue. And we've brought up World War I. How about World War II and Korea and Vietnam and the Middle East? And it's never going to end. I think the ring symbolizes perfectly his theory behind, we're never going to stop this continual circle of no beginning, no end.
I think you're onto something there, and you see evidence of that idea in the Two Towers, which we're going to cover on the next episode, which is the sort of, there's two big set battles in the Two Towers, right? Because it's basically switching to the villain's perspective, and so it's about Saruman the White being corrupted, and then Sauron really making the hammer fall hard on Mordor, which is the last realm of decent men, right? It's the last space where men who remember honor, and who remember their duty and are willing to do it, are located. But there's even corruption drifting into that. And we see that, by the way, we begin to see a touch of that in the Fellowship of the Ring with the actions of Boromir. Later on, we'll meet his brother Faramir. But the dynamics between Boromir and Aragorn, which we're not going to get into today. By the way, as usual, we don't read the whole book. It's too big a book.
Yeah, right.
If you don't know this book already, just go get it. But so we're not going to get into those dynamics, but they do exist, and Tolkien does explore those. To your point, that idea of the circle of never-ending power struggle, right? That never-ending venal need to be in charge.
Well, even if it's not a need to be in charge, there's always that need to have somebody in charge. So even if you don't want it to be you, you still push somebody forward, right? Like that's another dynamic of it. Like it's not always about.
It's interesting that you're bringing it's interesting that you're bringing this up to today because of a meeting that we had earlier today on another project that we're involved in. And it's interesting because I'm not going to get into the specifics of the conversation, but I was pushing that person to do that thing.
Yes.
And that person was resisting that push. And there's a circle there. And so I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Hopefully the people that were in that meeting this morning did not listen to this podcast. I'm just saying.
We didn't name them. We haven't named them. We haven't named the project. We haven't named the meeting. We just said in a meeting. That's all. Yeah. We're just in a meeting. Could have been any meeting. Could have been a meeting out on the street. We don't know. No one knows. Anyway, back to the book. Back to Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. As usual, I will tell you which version of this book that I am reading. So this is the let me go to the text here. This is the HarperCollins Publishers version of Lord of the Rings. Yes, it is the Clarion Books imprint of this. This was revised text along with new resets of the editions and new resets of the maps, which also Tolkien was messing around in. This version was copyright 2004, so this came out right around the time that the films came out, right a little bit afterward, because Fellowship of the Ring came out in 2001. Two Towers came out in 2002, and then Return of the King came out in 2003. And so this edition landed just in time for the 50th anniversary of Lord of the Rings. Go ahead, Tom.
I was just wait a minute. I didn't remember this. They produced these 3 massive, epically produced movies year after year after year, but we can't get a second Avatar movie in 15 or 12 years, whatever that was. What? We can't get a season 2 of the House of the Dragon for 2 years, but these guys can produce 3 epic movies back to back to back.
You might want to have a conversation with James Cameron.
I'm just asking.
And George R.R. Martin.
Yeah.
Maybe. You might want to have a conversation with him. That's all I'm saying. Go get that guy. We'll go have an email with that guy. We'll go have a meeting with that guy. I'm going to push him into some things. Anyway, back to the book. We're going to pick up in after some things have happened. There's been a flurry of action, and we're going to pick up in chapter 9 of book 1 at the sign of the prancing pony. So we're going to read a selection here. The men and dwarves were mostly talking of distant events and telling news of a kind that was becoming only too familiar. There was trouble away in the south, and it seemed that the men who had come up the green way were on the move, looking for lands where they could find some peace. The Bree folk were sympathetic, but plainly not very ready to take a large number of strangers into their land. Pause. That's immigration. Back to the book. One of the travelers, a squint-eyed, ill-favored fellow, was foretelling that more and more people would be coming north in the near future. If room isn't found for them, they'll find it for themselves. They've a right to live, same as other folk, he said loudly. The local inhabitants did not look pleased at the prospect. The hobbits did not pay much attention to all this, as it did not at the moment seem to concern hobbits. Big folk could hardly beg for lodgings in hobbit holes. They were more interested in Sam and Pippin, who were now feeling quite at home and were chatting gaily about events in the Shire. Pippin roused a good deal of laughter with an account of the collapse of the roof of Town Hall in Michelle Delving. Will Whitfoot, the mayor, and the fattest hobbit in West Farthing had been buried in chalk and came out like a floured dumpling. But there were several questions that made Frodo a little uneasy. One of the Brelanders, who seemed to have been in the Shire several times, wanted to know where the Underhills lived and who they were related to. Suddenly, Frodo noticed a strange-looking, weather-beaten man sitting in the shadows near the wall was also listening intently to the hobbit talk. He had a tall tankard in front of him and was smoking a long-stemmed pipe curiously carved. His legs were stretched out before him, showing high boots of supple leather that fitted him well, but had seen much wear and were now caked with mud. A travel-stained cloak of heavy dark green cloth was drawn close about him, and in spite of the heat of the room, he wore a hood that overshadowed his face, but the gleam of his eyes could be seen as he watched the hobbits. "Who is that?" Frodo asked when he got a chance to whisper to Mr. Butterbur. "I don't think you introduced him." "Him?" said the landlord in an answering whisper, cocking an eye without turning his head. "I don't rightly know. He's one of them wandering folk, rangers we call them. He seldom talks, not but what he can tell a rare tale when he has the mind. He disappears for a month or a year, and then he pops up again. He was in and out pretty often last spring, but I haven't seen him about lately. What his right name is, I've never heard, but he's known around here as Strider. Goes about at a great pace on his long shanks, though he don't tell nobody what cause he has to hurry. But there's no accounting for east or west, as we say in Bree, meaning the rangers and the Shire folk, begging your pardon. Funny you should ask about him." But at that moment, Mr. Butterbur was called away by a demand for more ale, and his last remark remained unexplained. Frodo found that Strider was now looking at him as if he had heard or guessed all that had been said. Presently, with a wave of his hand and a nod, he invited Frodo to come over and sit by him. As Frodo drew near, he threw back his hood, showing a shaggy head of dark hair flecked with gray, and in a pale, stern face, a pair of keen gray eyes. "I am called Strider," he said in a low voice. "I am very pleased to meet you, Master Underhill, if old Butterbur got your name right." "He did," said Frodo stiffly. He felt far from comfortable under the stare of those keen eyes. "Well, Master Underhill," said Strider, "if I were you, I should stop your young friends from talking too much. Drink, fire, and chance meetings are pleasant enough, but, well, this isn't the Shire. There are queer folk about, though I say it as shouldn't you may think," he added with a wry smile, seeing Frodo's glance. "And there have been even stranger travelers to Ree lately," he went on, watching Frodo's face. Frodo returned his gaze, but said nothing, as Strider made no further sign. His attention seemed suddenly to be fixed on Pippin. To his alarm, Frodo became aware that the ridiculous young Took, encouraged by his success with the fat mayor of Michael Delving, was now actually giving a comic account of Bilbo's farewell party. He was already giving an imitation of the speech and was drawing near to the astonishing disappearance. Frodo was annoyed. It was harmless enough tale for most of the local hobbits, no doubt, just a funny story about those funny people way beyond the river, but some, old Butterbur, for instance, knew a thing or two, and had probably heard rumors long ago about Bilbo's vanishing. It would bring the name of Baggins to their minds, especially if there had been inquiries in Bree after that name. Frodo fidgeted, wondering what to do. Pippin was evidently much enjoying the attention he was getting, and had become quite forgetful of their danger. Frodo had a sudden fear that in his present mood he might even mention the ring, and that might be well disastrous. "You had better do something quick," whispered Strider in his ear. Frodo jumped up and stood on a table and began to talk. The attention of Pippin's audience was disturbed. Some of the hobbits looked at Frodo and laughed and clapped, thinking that Mr. Underhill had taken as much ale as was good for him. Frodo suddenly felt very foolish and found himself, as was his habit when making a speech, fingering the things in his pocket. He felt the ring on its chain, and quite unaccountably the desire came over him to slip it on and vanish out of the silly situation. It seemed to him somehow as if the suggestion came to him from outside, from someone or something in the room. He resisted the temptation firmly, clasped the ring in his hand, as if to keep a hold on it and prevent it from escaping or doing any mischief. Us big folk are often known to say, and that's who the humans are, in the world of Tolkien, in the world of hobbits. Us big folk are often known to say that you can sometimes or you shouldn't tell a book by its cover, right? Or you can't tell a book by its cover, right? We're often known to say that appearances are deceitful, right? But sometimes appearances can be truthful. But at this point in the story, Frodo's on the road. And the road is a place, just like it was for Bilbo in The Hobbit, the road is a place of chaos. Even if you're a 50-year-old hobbit, by the way, Frodo was 50 when this adventure happened. And if you're a 50-year-old hobbit who should have known better, because you're not young, you've reached middle age now, you should be aware of chaos. You should be aware of the problems of appearances, right? But sometimes appearances can be truthful. Sometimes they can actually reveal things through the chaos. But we can only see those things if we actually look instead of just see on the surface. This is what you get with Strider, who will later be revealed to be Aragorn, the one true king of the big folk. And it is also what will be more and more revealed as Frodo and Samwise continue on their journey to the fiery vents of Mount Doom, where they've got to throw the ring in, which we're going to get to that part in just a second, because I got a question there for Tom about that. But this is something for leaders. Let's sort of jump on this early. When a leader gets a resume, actually not even a leader, when a hiring manager gets a resume, right? They're judging this person, and increasingly, because we now live in a world of algorithms, most people don't get to meet the actual human being behind the algorithm. And this is the problem of hiring. This is the problem of building a team. This is the problem of doing a project these days. We should probably be looking at people a little bit deeper, right, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer, right? Of course we should. That seems like to be a no-brainer. But the problem I think we have, to your point, and you alluded to this, we are at the mercy of algorithms in our entire lives, and people just don't they don't realize that how impactful they are to us on a day-to-day basis, right? So, I'll give you an example. You made a comment earlier about, actually, I apologize. It might not have been you, but it was a conversation I was having earlier. Somebody had mentioned something. I'll just use that way, phrase that way. Like the idea behind, oh, it was you. The idea behind, it just popped into my head. The idea behind having somebody with 25 years of experience and then us having no value to that person, right? Mm-hmm. Part of that comes from the algorithm, because what we value on the resume is these little points of data, but we're not looking beyond what that single point of data tells us. We don't really, people skim through resumes. So I know a couple hiring managers that I know, and by the way, so this really hits the heart of me when it comes to hiring salespeople, right? Because you're looking at a resume saying, oh, I was 110% of quota, I was this, I was that, I was this, that. But you have no idea if that person's personality fits your company profile. You have no idea if that person's thought process is aligned with your company's mission, or you can't tell that from a resume. So you're basically just going to skim through it, look for a couple of bullet points that you really want to see, and ignore everything else that's on there, right? It gets worse when they get to the interview. It gets worse because I show up dressed like this in a little polo shirt and whatever, and I have 25 years of experience underneath my belt, and I don't give a rat's patoot what my resume says. I know I can sell the green off of grass, right? Like, and somebody else shows up and they did a little bit of research on the company. I'll give them credit for that. But they do a little bit of research on the company and realize that the company is very old-fashioned. You have to wear a suit and tie to the interview, blah, blah, blah. They walk in a suit and tie with no experience whatsoever, and they get the job over somebody like me because I didn't look up the company. Now, granted, shame on me. I probably should have done that. But I'm just saying, to your point about looking a little deeper, in the interview, they're not asking me questions about culture fit and they're asking me questions like, so what brought you here today? And because they know damn well looking at me that they don't want to hire me because I walked in a polo shirt and not a suit. So that changes the course of their entire interview, as opposed to the guy who shows up, or girl, by the way, shows up in a perfect suit or a perfect business attire, and they start asking them questions like, so tell me the kind of place that you like to work, right? Like,
buddy of mine is going through this right now, and he has a background for whole. He's basically, think Anthony Bourdain. He's basically that guy.
Cool.
But he's walking in now to places trying to get hired, and he throws down his resume with 25 years of experience building restaurants, building teams, da. And literally, he told me this, and actually, it's in. You can go back and listen to the interview that we did, or not the interview, but the conversation that we did in the Hobbit. It's Ryan. He goes, they're just like, well, we'll just hire the hot girl. Like, go away. And he's like, he's walking out of these places going, what? You know, and it when you reduce people to data points, you're not going to get. This is my concern. This is how this ties into the piece that I brought there in Lord of the Rings. Strider is interviewing basically for the job of being king when we meet him.
Yeah.
But he's the most innocuous person ever. You're not going to pick that guy. And because you're not going to pick that guy, if he were interviewing today, if Strider were showing up to interview for the role of king today, he's not getting that job. He's too wild. He's too uncompromising. He doesn't fit the algorithm. Instead, they'll just hire the hot girl. They'll hire Liv Tyler. They'll just hire her. She's the hot girl. It's fine. And it's insane.
It is interesting. It is interesting though. Like, so, you know, you're talking like when you go in depth. So here's another thing too, and this drives me crazy about interview. I'm really talking about interviewing salespeople now, because this is probably the area of the company that I think needs the most work for everybody, right? Mm-hmm. For any company on the planet. So, like, one of the things that you're talking about, when somebody asks a salesperson on an interview, so tell me what motivates you, 100% of the time, the interviewer is expecting them to say money, because they want all of their salespeople to be greedy and money hungry and whatnot. When I ask that question, I specifically ask them to not say money, because I don't care. No, I'm sorry. Nobody is really anybody. The deepest root of somebody's passion is not going to be money. It's not. I'm sorry. It's not. So if somebody says, if I'm in an interview and I say to somebody, so, hey, son, so tell me what motivates you, and you can't say money because I know that's not true. So what wakes you up in the morning? What gets you so excited to be alive that it motivates you as a human being on a day-to-day basis?
Selling pens to change the West. Have I got the gig?
You got it.
All right, excellent.
But I mean, but at that point, they'll give me answers anywhere from my family to spending time with my ex to not ex person. I'm, as ex as in the letter, but but like, I just want to be clear. I'm not going to spend time with my ex. But, spending time with. I want to spend more time doing X. I want to spend time with my family, whatever that is, and then I say to them, so what drives you to do that? Like, why is that important to you? Because that's usually the real answer. That's usually the real motivating factor, is what people motivates people, right? So digging deeper to people is vital. I mean, it's just vital.
So, okay, let me frame something from literature in terms of sales. Let me do this. So Tolkien, I'll use Tolkien. Obviously, we're reading Lord of the Rings. Tolkien, right? Charles Portis, who wrote the book that True Grit, that the movie was based off of, right? The Kim Darby, John Wayne film of the 1960s, and then the update by the Coen brothers that had Jeff Bridges in it, right? Okay, True Grit. Charles Portis. Cormac McCarthy, who wrote The Road, that guy. Donna Tartt, who wrote Goldfinch. By the way, Donna Tartt writes one book every 10 years. Thomas Harris, who wrote all of the Hannibal Lecter books. those 5 authors that I've named, probably these days, based on algorithms driven by Amazon, could not get published. They would not have a career. The algorithm flattens everything from sales to creativity. It flattens everything. Now, I've named 5 writers there. Those 5 writers, if they were salespeople, you wouldn't get to see their resumes because they wouldn't make it past the algorithm.
Yeah, right.
And yet Charles Portis is going to sell for you, or Donna Tartt or Cormac McCarthy. People who are in those modes in sales aren't getting picked. My gigantic challenge question for you is this. If we have a civilization that relies on creativity and innovation, and yet we're flattening everything out, what are we going to wind up with? And by the way, you need a salesperson that can sell the creativity and the innovation. But if they're not creative or innovative themselves, how the hell are they going to sell it?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of I was talking with a colleague of mine who is a marketing strategist, and I asked him what his view of today's marketing world was, and he said it's more of the same. And I went, "What do you mean more of the same?" He goes, "Well, because the more things change, the more things stay the same. It's really that simple. It doesn't matter what technology we throw at it. It doesn't matter what." And I say the same thing about sales all the time, right? Like, it doesn't matter. Like, people buy from people they know, like, and trust. That has been the rule of thumb since the beginning of time, right? Like,
okay, but if
when we were bartering seeds for oxen, right? Like, it's
right. But okay, yeah, you said this before on the podcast. Like, seeds for
Yeah.
oxen, software doesn't matter. But
right.
you still need like a weirdo showing up. Like, what? The weirdo still needs a job.
No, but so directly to your point though. Think about it. People are going to buy from people they know, like, and trust. It takes all kinds for that. Like, not everybody is going to be attracted to my type of whatever
sales
humor,
approach.
Humor, well, whatever. My type of humor, my type of rapport building, my type of whatever. Pick one. Doesn't matter. So you need a balanced team, because if that customer says no to one salesperson, it doesn't mean they're going to say no to the other.
Right.
You need a more balanced team. So again, when I'm looking to hire, I'm looking for personalities that I have on my team, and the ones that I don't have are the resumes I'm looking for.
Yeah.
I don't use an algorithm. I'm sorry. I'll look at every resume I get, and I don't put them through these software packages that are, highlighting all these things. I just don't do it. Or even when I have clients that do it, I'm like, I try to sneak peek at the other ones, and I'll cherry pick out like the first 5 or 10 that I see that don't fit the algorithm, right? And I'll be like, let's just talk to them. You might be surprised. And it happens occasionally where I'm wrong and not a single one of the 5 of them make it past round 1. It happens. It happens. But it doesn't happen often, is all my point is.
Well, and you're a film guy. I'm going to relate this to film too. So, because there's something you said in sales that relates directly to film. So you're a film guy. Over the course of this is 2023. So over the course of the last 20 years since the last Lord of the Rings film writing has precipitously become more, and not precipitously, has become more and more garbage-like.
Yeah, for sure.
Because they're writing for the algorithm, right? So the problem isn't the upteenth origin story of Spider-Man, although we could do with a little less of that. Thank you very much.
I second that.
But the problem is the flattening of creativity and writing for the algorithm in the origin story of Spider-Man.
Yeah.
And what that does to creative people is then you get ideology, you get propaganda, you get all these other things that aren't art, quite frankly. It's creativity in the service of other ends. Let's just put it like that. And it's not that good. Like, there's a reason that the 2 biggest movies of this year, other than the writer's strike, because whatever, but the 2 biggest movies of this year were Barbie and Oppenheimer. There's a reason. Like, audiences are desperate for a Charles Portis written screenplay. They're desperate for a salesperson who can sell them a Charles Portis screenplay. They're
Right.
desperate for somebody who can sit in that executive suite at New Line Cinema or wherever the hell and go, hey, we're going to sell the hell out of this Peter Jackson lovingly built film that's absolutely amazing, and we will find an audience for it. They're looking for that level of creativity, that level of risk taking, and you're not going to get that because of the algorithm. The algorithm has flattened everything, and I know it's different algorithms in different places, different from high, but the same principle applies. You know,
Right.
Okay. By the way, one last thought. I'll put this on your plate. Speaking of movies, I keep hearing rumors that New Line Cinema is talking about redoing the original trilogy of the Lord of the Rings.
Well, if they do, why would they do that? Like, well, money, right? It's that simple. I mean, I'm, who are we to?
To your point.
Yeah, they're just going to do it because they think they can make more money off of it. But like, these were epic and very well done films. What are they going to do that's going to be better? Like, I understand remaking certain film. I get it. Like, or digitally remastering some of the old Star Wars movies. I get that too. Like, I understand. Like, there was one. Was it Return of the Jedi?
You're more forgiving of Lucas than I am on that one.
Was it Return of the Jedi at the end scene when they're at the Ewok village and they're celebrating, and then
Yeah.
they added later the three images of the. Okay, whatever. Like, I get that, but they're not. That's not remaking the whole movie. You're just adding this little dash, right? But for this, what would they? I don't understand what they would gain, and what would they change? Like, that's the one thing I'd like to ask.
The only thing that I could think of that maybe they could potentially add in, and this was a knock from Lord of the Rings fans, and I got to be honest, I didn't think it took away anything from the original trilogy, but Lord of the Rings fans do, and they've been screaming about it for 20 years. So Peter Jackson literally skipped over all of Tom Bombadil's story in the book. And that's fairly significant. It is fairly significant to the forward motion of Frodo and the Hobbits and Gandalf. It is critical there. There's some critical information that Tom Bombadil provides that then sets up what we're about to read, the Council of Elrond and some other things that happen later on. So I get the objection to Tom Bombadil. Plus, there's some interesting things that entire chapter in, I believe it's in book 1, that entire chapter focuses on, that set up Tolkien's ideas about environmentalism versus nature that later on you see evidence of in Two Towers. So when Saruman is felling all the trees in Two Towers, an entire sequence, right, to build out the orcs.
Yeah.
The movie audience has no clue why the guy is doing this, but Tom Bombadil gives that clue for the trees and a bunch of other different things that are happening. So I could see maybe addressing that, but to me, that was a minor point.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't do. Other than that, I have no clue what they. I do. I think it's a money grab. I agree with you. I think it's a money grab.
Yeah, think about, because a lot of the remakes, they're did we not talk about White Man Can't Jump on this podcast at one point?
We have never addressed White Man Can't Jump.
Maybe we talked about it after the fact. I don't remember, but like, that was not a good movie. They should have just left well enough alone. The original movie was hilarious. It was great. Good chemistry between Woody Harrelson and Wesley Snipes. The whole thing was done pretty well. Pretty well. They remake, they tried too hard. They just went too far. Like, they just leave it alone. Like, I don't understand why you need to remake some of these movies.
Because this is the algorithm. The algorithm says there was an audience here. And now the algorithm is going way the hell out to the long tail. That's why you're seeing, like, forget White Man Can't Jump. You're seeing like the remake of 21 Jump Street.
Yeah, that one too. That was another one. Yeah.
Like, I always ask this when I see these previews, whenever I happen to go to the movie theater with my kids. I will sit there and I will literally say out loud, who is crying out for this? No one? No one's crying out for this? Why are we making this movie?
Yeah.
I don't care. Like, this is what but then everybody in the theater is on their phones and like they're not paying attention anyway. It doesn't matter. Cares anyway. Right. Nobody cares anyway. And you it's really hard. No, it's not really hard. If the algorithm is determining what you are doing and it has to go way the heck out on the long tail because there's nothing more left on the fat head. And we've kind of talked about this concept before, but the fat head is mass culture and the long tail is everything that's happening out on the internet. And the long tail has pockets of mass, but it doesn't have anything that's like the mass of the mid 20th century where 65 million people were watching Johnny Carson. You don't have anything like that anymore. And that's, by the way, what all these movie studios and corporations that are hiring salespeople, they all want to return to that, because that was steady, even money that you could count on for 20 years and build on. We're in a time of chaos. Corporations, organizations, creativity, it doesn't like that stuff. But the algorithm can only take you so far. And then you have to come up with something original. And by the way, this is the wall that Disney is hitting now. They've there's another word that I was going to use. But I'm not going to use that word. I'm going to go higher. I'm going to go high while they go low. They have eviscerated their entire back catalog. And now we're down to Snow White and the 7 unnamed people of an unknown origin while she's empowered. What are we doing? And by the way, they should scrap that. They should absolutely.
The Fest and the 7 beings. Sorry.
Don't apologize. You're correct. There'll be 7 non-binary bipedal animals walking around with maybe singing a song. Although that might be too specific, so we'll have them just doing stuff. Who the hell knows?
We'll have them hum along.
Yeah. The algorithm will write the script. It's fine.
It's fine.
And this is what the writers are striking against, by the way.
Yes.
Because their ultimate goal, or not their ultimate goal, their ultimate concern, and I definitely agree with them on this. I don't agree with a whole lot of other stuff that they're screaming about, but the writers, for sure, they are concerned about the Chat GPTs of the world just finally taking all of their jobs. And what they don't understand is the Charles Portises, the Cormac McCarthys, the Donna Tartts that are in their industry that are doing writing. Weirdly enough, I think we're at the spot where you need to have the algorithm just take over everything and make it all blanded vanilla, because what's going to happen is people are still going to be looking for that spicy experience, and they're going to go to the edges to find it, and you're going to make a ton of money on the edges. You just have to be clever about it.
So the mainstream will be all the Chat GPT stuff, and you'll see stuff at Sundance or film festivals like that will be the stuff that we really want to see, we really are interested in seeing.
Or I would go even further out to the edges. I've long made the claim, and I wish writers would do this, but YouTube is where you should be releasing films. Now, I get it that the how you monetize that becomes gigantically problematic for a whole variety of reasons. But I'm watching a few studios start to get built and a few projects start to happen. Angel Studios that distributed Sound of Fury and also does The Chosen, regardless of what you may think about their religious bent, that's an example of projects out to the edges that that can get traction. And by the way, don't cost $100 million to make, or 200 million or 300 million, and have to make back twice that much on a ridiculous marketing budget. Those are examples of those kinds of projects where you can push it to the edges because there's a whole plethora of demographic of people that want to see good stuff. They're still there,
Sure.
So anyway, yeah, let's get back to the book. But this is happening everywhere. This is happening in sales. This is happening in marketing. This is happening in finance. It's been happening in finance for quite some time. And if we can't fight the algorithm, then let's at least try to escape from it.
Right.
And I think Tolkien would agree, by the way. He wouldn't be a fan of the algorithm either. He'd be like, no, that is not who I'm writing for. I'm writing for real human beings. Back to the book. Back to Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring. We're going to pick up with chapter 2, book 2, the Council of Elrond. Suddenly, as they were talking, a single clear bell rang out. "This is the warning bell for the Council of Elrond," cried Gandalf. "Come along now. Both you and Bilbo are wanted." Frodo and Bilbo followed the wizard quickly along the winding path back to the house. Behind them, uninvited and for the moment forgotten, trotted Sam. By the way, Samwise Gamgee, he's the gardener. Gandalf led them to the porch where Frodo had found his friends the evening before. The light of the clear autumn morning was now glowing in the valley. The noise of the bubbling waters came up from the foaming riverbed. Birds were singing, and a wholesome peace lay on the land. To Frodo, his dangerous flight and the rumors of the darkness growing in the world outside already seemed only the memories of a troubled dream, but the faces that were turned to meet them as they entered were grave. Elrond was there, and several others were seated in silence about him. Frodo saw Glorfindel and Gloin, and in a corner alone, Strider was sitting clad in his old travel-worn clothes again. Elrond drew Frodo to a seat by his side and presented him to the company, saying, "Here, my friends, is the Hobbit, Frodo, son of Drogo. Few have ever come hither through greater peril, or on an errand more urgent." He then pointed out and named those whom Frodo had not met before. There was a younger dwarf at Gloin's side, his son Gimli. Beside Glorfindel, there were several other counselors of Elrond's household, of whom Eristor was the chief, and with him was Galdor, an elf from the Grey Havens, who had come on an errand from Cerdon, the shipwright. There was also a strange elf clad in green and brown, Legolas, a messenger from his father, Thranduil, the king of the elves of northern Mirkwood. And seated a little apart was a tall man with a fair and noble face, dark-haired and gray-eyed, proud and stern of glance. He was cloaked and booted, as if for a journey on horseback, and indeed, though his garments were rich and his cloak was lined with fur, they were stained with long travel. He had a collar of silver, in which a single white stone was set. His locks were shorn about his shoulders. On a baldric he wore a great horn, tipped with silver, that was now laid upon his knees. He gazed at Frodo and Bilbo with sudden wonder. "Here," said Elrond, turning to Gandalf, "is Boromir, a man from the south. He arrived in the gray morning and seeks for counsel. I have bidden him to be present, for here his questions will be answered." So we're going to move ahead a little bit, and we're going to pick up a little bit after they are talking. "It is now many years ago," said Gawain, "that a shadow of disquiet fell on our people. Whence it came we did not at first perceive. Words began to be whispered in secret. It was said that we were hemmed in a narrow place, and that greater wealth and splendor could be found in a wider world. Some spoke of Moria, the mighty works of our fathers that are called in our own tongue Khazad-dûm, and they declared that now at last we had the power and numbers to return." Gloin sighed. "Moria, Moria, wonder of the northern world. Too deep we delved there, and woke the nameless fear. Long have its vast mansions lain empty since the children of Durin fled. But now we spoke of it again, and with longing, and yet with dread. For no dwarf has dared to pass through the doors of Khazad-dûm for many lives of kings, save Thror only, and he perish. At last, however, Balin listened to the whispers and resolved to go, and though Dain did not leave willingly, he took with him Ori and Oin and many more of our folk, and they went away south. That was nigh on 30 years ago. For a while we had news, and it seemed good. Messages reported that Moria had been entered and a great work begun there. Then there was silence, and no word has ever come from Moria since. Then about a year ago, a messenger came to Dain, but not from Moria, from Mordor, a horseman in the night, who called Dain to his gate. The Lord Sauron the Great, so he said, wished for our friendship. Rings he would give for it, such as he gave of old. And he asked urgently concerning hobbits, of what kind they were, and where they dwelt. For Sauron knows, said he, that one of these was known to you on a time. At this we were greatly troubled, and we gave no answer. And then his fell voice was lowered, and he would have sweetened it if he could. A small token only of your friendship, Sauron asks this, he said, that you should find this thief, such was his word, and get from him, willing or no, a little ring, the least of rings, that once he stole. It is but a trifle that Sauron fancies, and an earnest of your goodwill. Find it, and the 3 rings that the dwarf sires possessed of old shall be returned to you, and the realm of Moria shall be yours forever. Find only news of the thief, whether he still lives and where, and you shall have great reward and lasting friendship from the Lord. Refuse, and things will not seem so well. Do you refuse?" At this, his breath came like the hiss of snakes, and all who stood by shuddered. But Dain said, "I said neither yea nor nay. I must consider this message and what it means under its fair cloak." "Consider well, but not too long," said he. "The time of my thought is my own to spend," Dain answered. "For the present," said he, and rode into the darkness. Heavy have the hearts of our chieftains been since that night. We needed not the fell voice of the messenger to warn us that his words held both menace and deceit, for we already knew the power that has re-entered Mordor has not changed, and ever it betrayed us of old. Twice the messenger has returned and has gone unanswered. The third and last time, so he says, is soon to come before the ending of the year. And so I have been sent at last by Dane to warn Bilbo that he is sought by the enemy and to learn, if may be, why he desires this ring, this least of rings. Also, we crave the advice of Elrond, for the shadow grows and draws nearer. We discover that messengers have come also to King Brandon Dale, and that he is afraid. We fear that he may yield. Already war is gathering on his eastern borders. If we make no answer, the enemy may move men of his own rule to assail King Brand and Dane also. You have done well to come, said Elrond. You will hear today all that you need in order to understand the purposes of the enemy. There is naught that you can do other than to resist with hope or without it, but you do not stand alone. You will learn that your trouble is but part of the trouble of all the Western world. The ring? What shall we do with the ring? The least of rings, the trifle that Sauron fancies. That is the doom we must deem. That is the purpose for which you are called hither. Called, I say, though I have not called you to me, strangers from distant lands. You have come and are here met in this very nick of time, by chance, as it may seem. Yet it is not so. I believe rather that it is so ordered that we who sit here and none others must now find counsel for the peril of the world. Now, therefore, things shall be openly spoken that have been hidden from all but a few until this day. And first, so that all may understand what is the peril, the tale of the ring shall be told from the beginning even to this present. And I will begin that tale, though others shall end it. Not to be facetious, but could the entire experience of the Council of Elrond have been an email? Do we really need to have a meeting about this?
I mean, can't most of these meetings be an email? I mean, let's be realistic here. I mean, the only reason we bother to have these types of meetings are just because we want to, you know what? It goes back to the power and money thing, right?
Yep.
Like, it doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter what you're arguing about. You want to see the face on the person when they realize that they lost that argument or they lost that battle. You have to see it, because otherwise, you're right. It could all be an email. And back in the day in World War I, it could have been a letter. I'm gonna write you a letter. You write me a letter. I win. We walk away. Whatever, right? Like it's. But the reality
I'm not even gonna waste telegraph typing on this.
Yeah, exactly.
And your video conferencing software isn't making it any better in 2023, by the way. Like, you know, I like the way the Council of Elrond was handled by Tolkien, and then of course how Peter Jackson translated that over into the film. By the way, I will always see Mr. Smith as Elrond. I just will for the rest of my life. It's Mr. Smith. Oh, hey, how you doing? Good to see you. Good to see you showing up. Anyway, leaders struggle to make meetings meaningful, right? Because the participants in the meeting aren't there for the same reasons as the leader very often.
Yeah, for sure.
And, you know, there's all kinds of, I mean, we've seen this in meetings we've been in. I've seen this most recently and sharply. It's interesting that I'm having this conversation now, but most recently and sharply in several real live meetings that I've been in, where, you know, egos and attention and selfishness and all of these things, lack of attention, a lack of focus, they all kill the goals of the meeting. And, you know, I'm sitting there, and maybe I'm spoiled. I got to admit, maybe I'm spoiled because I've been able to be out of it and been able to construct an existence where I can still get paid without having to go to meetings. So maybe I'm spoiled on this one. And I'll admit it, it's probably a me problem. But I'm sitting around the table going, what are we doing here? Like, what's the point of this meeting? But the Council of Elrond was a little bit, I mean, look, Frodo cut through it, everything at the end. And he said, listen, I'll just do it. I'll be the guy. All of you can stop arguing about who's going to be the guy and who did what to who with the history and the egos, and I'll be the guy. you can't have heroism, and this is my larger point with this section. You cannot have heroism by committee, because everyone that was around that table were all more qualified to be heroes than Frodo. The Bible, when God talks to Samuel, the prophet Samuel, who anointed David to be king, Samuel basically is, kind of he goes to David's father's house, and he asks him, are these all the sons that you have? and he's like, David's father is bringing forth, of course, the hale and hearty sons, the ones who are like 6 feet tall and good looking, the William McKinleys, basically, or to update it, they're bringing in the LeBron Jameses, right? They're just bringing them in, they're bringing them in. And Samuel asks, is it this one? Yes, God, basically, in that moment, is this this person? And God tells him, listen, man looks on the outside. I don't look at the outside. I look at what's going on the inside. And none of these guys are the right guy, which there's something to be said for that. And then, of course, if this were a basketball team, Samuel anoints David. And if this were a basketball team, David would be Spud Webb. And if you don't know who that is, just go look at some Tom's
one of my favorite players of all time.
Tom knows who Spud Webb is.
I know exactly who Spud Webb is.
So, but this is what's happening at the Council of Elrond. Frodo is Spud Webb. He's David. He's the guy that's the least likely to do the thing. 2 questions. Why doesn't, other than could the Council of Elrond meeting have been an email? But 2 questions. 1, why does heroism by committee not work? And 2, this kind of ties back into the algorithm thing, but it kind of pushes it a little bit further. Why do we miss where heroism actually is? Why do we miss it so often?
Why do we miss it? Well, hold on. I'll ask that question afterwards.
Sure.
So the heroism by committee.
By committee. Why doesn't that work?
Well, I mean, can you really say it doesn't work at all? Like there have been other stories aside from this one where you have a team of 2, 3, 5 people that go and do the thing or whatever, and then when let's take like small group of military people, like a SEAL team, right?
Okay, sure, yeah.
Take a SEAL team. They go in, they do their thing, they come out. You talk to the SEALs. You talk to the SEAL team leader.
Yeah.
Hey, that's my life. Anyway,
SEAls, whatever, same thing.
Talk to the SEAL team leader and say, "Hey, this was wildly successful. What made you so successful?" And he always defers to the team, right? It's always it wasn't me. It was a team effort. These guys, if I couldn't do it without these guys were the backbone. Blah 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 blah. Right? It's always deferred glory to the best. To the team. So it's not that it doesn't exist. I think the algorithm prefers that person you could put on the pedestal, right? Like that worship that let's put them up. I think it just prefers that. We as a society don't want to look. We could never look at that and go, I like this. My better movie reference. Like John Rambo doesn't really exist. Right, like that guy does not. That one guy that you can, ship into the middle of some rainforest to destroy a whole, slew of
battalion.
Yeah. That doesn't that's not real either. That's not real life. But that's what we want because it's not real life. We want to see that, right? Whereas the reality of it is that SEAL Team 6 is going in there and destroying that small country or whatever, and that's more realistic, but that's not as glorified and exemplified. Like we can't put that on a pedestal. We can't put those 6, 7, 8, 10 guys on a pedestal or girls and say, look at how awesome they are, right?
Well, and
every athlete, by the way, every athlete that you determine is the GOAT, because they don't think of themselves like that, by the way. But every athlete that you determine the GOAT, you ask them what made them so great, and every single one of them is going to tell you it was the team around them. Every one of them.
Michael Jordan won't say that.
Well, he might not say that now, but that's because of all the BS happening with LeBron. I mean, come on, like that. But when you asked him back in the day, he leaned on Scottie Pippen all the time.
All the time. Yeah,
like Scottie. Me and Scottie did this, and Scottie did that, and Scottie did this, Scottie did that. He never took the glory. He got the glory, but he never took it.
Right.
Whereas today, LeBron takes it. Like he's like, yes, it's me. I'm great. I don't care who's on my team. I'm gonna go win a championship. Like he just that's the way, and he doesn't talk like that. So please, if you're a
No.
LeBron lover, I don't mean it that way. I'm saying what visually what we see,
Mm-hmm.
what our brain interprets is him being exemplified and glorified, right? But again, every other that's why there's still a debate, by the way. That's why there's still a debate on whether or not who's better, LeBron or Michael Jordan. And now Michael Jordan's coming out saying, yeah, I was better. But he's saying I was better because I was a better leader. It wasn't because he was a better basketball player. Skill set to skill set, who the hell cares? But when you look at who really exemplifies what the game is about, what the essence and the spirit of the game, Michael Jordan is going to win this argument all the time.
Okay, so now we can talk about egos, and don't worry, we'll get to my second question about heroism in unlooked for places. We'll get to that in a minute. But
Sure.
let's do a side job because we almost never talk on this podcast after 75 episodes of 75 books that we've read. Actually 75 books I've read. You've been along for about 25 of the books so far. And I'm not knocking you. You've just been around for about 25 of them. It's fine.
You started without me. I'm good.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I'm not going to say anything about being the greatest or anything like that. I'll let other people decide that. um, Egos. Okay, so egos, right? I'm going to jump to World War II. Eisenhower, when he was planning D-Day, had to manage had to manage all of the generals, right? He had to manage Montgomery, who was an ego-driven British class-driven maniac. Okay, Montgomery was ridiculous. He had to manage the French resistance, who wanted in and would have wrecked the whole friggin' thing. He had to manage Patton, who was another egotistical driven guy who didn't respect Montgomery by a long chalk, like just didn't. Then he also had to manage not Eisenhower, but Eisenhower, yeah. He had to manage Roosevelt, Churchill. Now, Stalin wasn't part of that because Stalin was just like, hey, you know what? I don't think you boys could pull it off. It's an amphibious landing across open ocean that's never been done successfully in human history up to this point. You all have a good day. We're going to keep coming across the flat plain and deal with Stalingrad. You have a good day. And by the way, when the Americans and the British and the Canadians pulled off the D-Day landings, Stalin was stunned. He had no idea that was what he was dealing with. He was literally caught flat-footed. It was like, oh, wait, you actually took me seriously that you were going to open up a Western Front? I thought we were just having body talk. Like I thought we were just hanging around. I didn't think you were serious. Oh, okay. I guess we're gonna have a game now, right? But in World War II, Eisenhower had to hold all those guys together, all those egos. You talk about LeBron super teams. The thing that's killed LeBron super teams in basketball is the egos. It just
For sure.
And the coaches that they've put in charge of these super teams haven't been able to wrangle those egos. They just haven't. Like Phil Jackson was able to wrangle Michael Jordan's ego up until probably about the last couple of seasons that Jordan was playing in the 90s. But Phil Jackson, and by that point, by the way, they had enough of a relationship where he could kind of let the dog off the chain to kind of just go eat, right? But Phil Jackson, Michael Jordan wouldn't have been Michael Jordan without Phil Jackson. But Phil Jackson knew he had to manage Michael Jordan's ego. We almost never talk about egos on this podcast, but egos are everywhere. The problem with a super team, the problem with a committee, the problem with a fellowship of like 8 people getting together trying to get a ring to like freaking Mount Doom. It's egos. Boromir, in the book, he tries to take the ring from Frodo because he's like, I can wield it better than you can. Plus, I need to take it back to my home. Like, come on, like we're having a real problem and you can't handle it. It's me. I can take it, right? That's ego. How do you... We like the humble hero, but we we don't fully acknowledge the presence of ego, and I don't understand why we struggle with this. Like you just talked about the Navy SEALs. So Jocko Willink talks about on his friggin' podcast all the time. He talks about ego all the friggin' time, because on a small team like the SEALs, a big ego can wreck the whole friggin' thing, and that's why he talks about it, because that's what he's had to engage with for 20 years.
But don't you feel like the best teams have matching egos? Like you can have a big ego as long as the rest of your team has a big ego, right? Like it's like
someone's going to try to be a dog. Someone's going to try to be a big dog on that, particularly on teams where everybody's sort of at the same. You talk about skill level. Everybody's got the same skill level. Like if I'm on a SEAL team, I can pick up that guy's gun and do his job too. That's kind of how that's how tight we are. Just like if I go down, he can pick up my gun and do my job. So there's literally we're interchangeable. We now have the same skill sets.
But that's where hierarchy comes in, right? So you all have a relatively balanced amount of ego. I'm not saying good, high or low, because the same rule would apply if nobody has the ego, right? Have you ever been into a meeting where nobody has the ego and nobody wants to be in charge, and you're like, what is going on? Nothing is going to get done. Like somebody has to take. So it's like, so the same rule applies with no ego, zero ego in the room or big egos in the room. As long as they're balanced and there's a true hierarchy, it doesn't matter. Like it will work, which is why the military works like that, right? Because they understand the chain of command. Everyone can do everyone's job, but there's a very clear chain of command there as well. So that will power through that. In business or in business leadership, it's the same idea. You have this hierarchy of leadership. You have your C-level, your mid-level management, you have your management levels, like your low-level managers, and then you have your grunts, right? Like, so if you're talking about, if you bring that same meeting involved with the middle-level managements, like all the director levels, and they all have big egos, but it's being run by a senior VP of whatever, they know that there's some hierarchy there. So their ego, no matter how big it is, should not be challenging to the bigger ego in the room. So you get a lot more done. And I think that's how Phil Jackson was, by the way, because Phil Jackson was a player. He was a decent player. He had some clout there, right? Like I know this because I know what you're doing. I know how you're doing this. I can do this with you. Like, so coaches that have been players that have the same level of ego as that number one, that big player, which is by the way, LeBron didn't win a championship the first, like, forever, because his ego was bigger than his coaches. And he didn't respect his coaching staff the way he should.
Okay, so, well, in the Eisenhower example that I used to start this off, Eisenhower, and this was his brilliance, by the way, in dealing with all of those generals. Again, the two biggest problems on there were Montgomery and Patton. Like, dear God, like my God. But he also had to deal with like 3-star generals and 2-star generals that all thought they should have been 4 stars, but weren't. Right. And I didn't even mention George Marshall in there. That was, I'm like, I think if I remember World War II history correctly, the U.S. government offered George Marshall the option to run the D-Day thing, and he was like, I don't want to be Supreme Allied Commander. I don't want to put up with that. Because he knew exactly what it was going to be. Eisenhower's genius, and this is also what he did as president later on, but Eisenhower's genius was get the hell out of the way and never show his own ego. That was his brilliance. He was the leader who got out of the way. He had an ego, but he didn't show his ego.
But that's
sort of set back to the side a little bit.
But that's part of the brilliance of it, right? His ego was so big and so dominant that he didn't need to push his ego onto everybody. He basically set the wheels in motion, let people do their jobs, and then he like that was brilliant. Today's leaders in the workforce should take a note from that, right? Like, so just because you are quote unquote in charge doesn't mean that you have to do everything. Doesn't mean that every ounce of delegation has to come from your mouth, right? Like, empower your people, allow them to make small decisions as long as they fall within the guidelines of the bigger operation.
Well, and the guy who did this in the Fellowship of the Ring, just to bring it back to the book for just a second, the guy who did this in the Fellowship of the Ring was Gandalf. Yes, Gandalf allowed himself to be a number 2 to Frodo. Whereas in The Hobbit, Gandalf basically pushed Bilbo out the door. Not basically, he pushed Bilbo out the door to get the hell on the road, because Bilbo wasn't Bilbo was not inclined to go. I'd rather stay home, thank you.
Yeah.
whereas whereas Frodo, yeah, he kind of sort of had to nudge him a little bit, but along the course of time, Gandalf separates, and you'll see this in Two Towers and Return of the King. Gandalf separates from Frodo and lets Frodo be that person instead of taking over the entire fellowship, which we're going to talk about the death of, well, seeming death of Gandalf here in just a moment. Okay, the question we didn't talk about, we gotta address this one. So when we look at heroism, right? When we look at how that's judged by human beings who look at the outside, and this is Malcolm Gladwell writes about this in his book Outliers. I think it might be Outliers, or it might be Blink. Anyway, it's the William McKinley problem. So President William McKinley was nominated to be president because he was 6 feet tall. He was just taller than everybody else at the convention, so they thought he was a leader. By the way, this happens to tall people all the time. Now I know I'm speaking to a gentleman of maybe shorter stature, so this happens to tall people all the time. I've had this experience in my life. I'm 6'2". I've had this experience in my life. If you're a head taller than everybody else, people just think you know stuff. You don't. You're the same idiot as everybody else, but people think that you know things. And so this is a well-documented psychosocial phenomenon that occurs throughout cultures, by the way. The biggest, strongest guy gets to be the leader. And yet, this is that King David idea. This is the Frodo idea. And I think it's the idea that Tolkien is putting in here in Lord of the Rings. They're not the most competent, and they're not the people who probably should be the leader. And by the way, the guy that to go back to the biblical example, the guy that Samuel was seeking to replace, Saul is described in the Bible as being a head taller than everybody else. And when he was going to be brought out to be the king before he went all bad, it took him 20 years to go nuts. But before he went nuts, nobody could find him at the coronation ceremony because he was hiding. It's brilliant. It's in First Samuel. It's genius. And you just read that and you go, there's something in the realm or in the fabric of reality that makes us fooled by appearances.
Well, that's also true. If you look it up, statistically speaking, there are more CEOs over 6 feet than not. I don't remember where I read that, so you'll have to fact check it. But I do remember reading some. I thought it was the most bizarre statistic I've ever heard of. Like, if you take the Fortune 500, there's a certain percentage that are over 6 feet. It's like the highest percentage of height or something like that is over 6 feet. It's the most bizarre thing I think I've ever read.
Well, what percentage of sales, because you're a sales guy, what percentage of sales are closed by a person who's not model level attractive, because you're not going to run into those people, but just moderately good looking, versus a person who has like a scar on their face, but may have great sales experience? Like, who are you gonna, the hot girl versus my buddy at the bar, right?
Yeah.
Like, why do we do that? Why do we do that?
That's I've never been able to figure that out, because I am neither tall nor attractive, so that I don't understand how I've been successful, to be honest with you. But kidding.
He's now questioning his entire existence.
No, I was going to say, I am not going to say, kidding aside, because I am partially kidding about this, but I've been very successful in sales, and I am neither tall nor, in my opinion, attractive, or considering what you're talking about. But and here's something even interesting that I found. Maybe it explains something to all of the people that I found as mentors were similar to me, because I needed to know how they did it, not fitting that mold that you're talking about. And quite honestly, there were two things that I did that no other salesperson did. One was, I always did the things nobody else wanted to do, meaning, make that one extra call, stay 5 minutes, stay late, stay after 5 o'clock, or stay. I always did what others, and I was never going to be outworked. Like, there was no salesperson that worked as hard as I did. Like, so, and I start thinking about like my athletic career too as a kid. And you know, again, on this podcast, we've mentioned a couple times, I played semi-pro football. I'm not a big guy, but nobody would ever outwork me on a practice field, on a game field. There was never somebody that was going to work harder than I was. And there's never going to be somebody that's going to be more respectful of the game than I was. Right. So it's interesting that you say that, because I've competed against those guys and won. But the reason that I won was probably not the traditional values of what you're talking about, because I do agree. When I've had sales teams of attractive and I'll say attractive and middle of the road looking people, like, and I would never not hire somebody because of the scar on their face or whatever, because I know what they feel like I know what they're going through. So I would never do that. I would always hire people that would, you know, surprise people and to be, I would say successful in spite of X, whatever that X is. But you're right. There is patterns there for sure, for absolute certainty. But
and I think
the statistical anomalies are there as well. There are the outliers. There are the people that don't care what they look like. They don't care what their stature is. That they're going to go be successful regardless. And those are the people I want on my team, by the way. I've also had attractive people, by the way, feel the same way. I've looked at them and go, "What do you have? You have nothing to worry about." And they're like, they don't see themselves the way we see them. So there are people that are attractive, that are tall, that they don't see what we see. So they still go and try to outwork people or outmaneuver people they'll still, and that makes them even more deadly in that sense, right? Because now they're a double-edged sword.
It's a Tom Brady phenomenon. Like, that's a good looking guy. Like, I normally wouldn't admit to that, but that's a good looking guy. Okay. Like, I can see why people would cross the street for that guy. And he can throw a freaking spot. This is the first year in many years, and it stuck. I was shocked. That the retirement stuck this time.
Yeah.
But apparently he's actually finished.
Yeah.
That dude can still throw a tight spiral.
For sure.
That dude can still clear a football field and look good doing it. And that's stupid.
Well, think about this. You bring up Tom Brady at what, 6'4" or whatever he is, right? He's like 6'4", 6'5", somewhere around there. In my opinion, somebody who is just as successful, albeit a couple of championships less. But Drew Brees is like 6 foot barely.
Oh, yeah.
Scar on his face. So we're talking about scar, right? And still successul, right? Because he felt like he had something to prove. It was the little man syndrome, right? Like we all have it.
We all have the chip on our shoulder about something.
And for the record, for his time and era, Napoleon was not short, just for the record. So Napoleon was short by today's standards, but not by his time frame standards. He was actually average height, just for the record. So this Napoleon complex thing is a bunch of BS.
Well, I will say this. And we got to turn the corner here. We got to wrap this up. We got to turn the corner. But I will say this. I think the last form of discrimination that's okay is discrimination against the ugly, because it's so subjective. It's not objective. There is zero objective standard, and everybody knows there's zero objective standard. Because there's zero objective standard in attraction. So we don't like talking about that in relation to beauty, because it kind of wigs us out to sort of pull that apart. But attractiveness, beauty, and then what is ugly and unattractive, that's that disgust sensitivity that we have. So the same thing that makes you go, oh, that person's ugly, I wouldn't date them, is the same thing when you like drive over, drive past roadkill. You're like, ugh, like that. It's the same thing. But that is an area of, it's interesting. That's an area of human psychology and experience that is just beginning to be fully researched. And so we actually really don't know how all that ties together psychologically. We just know that it does. And then, that it then ties into reproduction and, of course, the continuation of the species. Are people actually getting prettier? Or are people continuing to remain, average? One final point I'll make about this, and then we can move along. the way that Tolkien describes all the people of the Fellowship of the Ring, he describes them all as beautiful, right? And particularly the elves, who are ethereal and float above it all. And I'm annoyed by the elves. They're the Tom Brady's of like the Lord of the Rings. Like, I'm annoyed by all of you. You could all shoot straight and you're all beautiful. Go away. I'm much more a fan of the dwarfs, right? Um, who are, short and kind of hairy and obnoxious, and run short distances because they don't run. They're like, I don't run. I'm not really about all that. But if you need them in a pinch, they'll be fine. And don't you dare toss them. Don't you dare. That's just my part there. That's what I'm a partisan for. All right, back to the book. Back to the Lord of the Rings. So we're going to sort of close our exploration here of the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring. Once again, we're not reading the whole book. We can't. But we are we're going to close with chapter 5, book 2. The Bridge at Khazad-dûm. Now for the last race, said Gandalf. If the sun is shining outside, we may still escape. After me. He turned left and sped across the smooth floor of the hall. The distance was greater than it had looked, and they ran. As they ran, they heard the beat and echo of many hurrying feet behind. A shrill yell went up. They had been seen. There was a ring and a clash of steel. An arrow whistled over Frodo's head. Boromir laughed. They did not expect this, he said. The fire has cut them off. We were on the wrong side. Look ahead, called Gandalf. The bridge is near. It is dangerous and narrow. Suddenly, Frodo saw before him a black chasm. At the end of the hall, the floor vanished and fell to an unknown depth. The outer knob could only be reached by a slender bridge of stone without curb or rail that spanned the chasm with one curving spring of 50 feet. It was an ancient defense of the dwarves against any enemy that might capture the first hall and the outer passages. They could only pass across it in single file. At the brink, Gandalf halted, and the others came up in a pack behind. Lead the way, Gimli, he said. Perry and Pippin and Merry next. Straight on, and up the stair beyond the door. Arrows fell among them. One struck Frodo and sprang back. Another pierced Gandalf's hat and stuck there like a black feather. Frodo looked behind. Beyond the fire, he saw swarming black figures. There seemed to be hundreds of orcs. They brandished spears and scimitars, which shone as red as blood in the firelight. Doom, doom, rolled the drum beats, growing louder and louder. Doom, doom. Legolas turned and set an arrow to the string, though it was a long shot for his small bow. He drew, but his hand fell, and the arrow slipped to the ground. He gave a cry of dismay and fear. Two great trolls appeared. They bore great slabs of stone and flung them down to serve as gangways over the fire, but it was not the trolls that had filled the elf with terror. The ranks of the orcs had opened up, and they crowded away as if they themselves were afraid. Something was coming up behind them. What it was could not be seen. It was like a great shadow, in the middle of which was a dark form of a man's shape, maybe yet greater, and a power and a terror seemed to be in it and to go before it. It came to the edge of the fire. The light faded as if a cloud had bent over it. Then with a rush, it leaped across the fissure. The flames roared up to greet it and wreathed about it, and a black smoke swung in the air. Its streaming mane kindled and blazed behind it. In its right hand was a blade like a stabbing tongue of fire. In its left, it held a whip of many thongs. Aye, aye, wailed Legolas. A Balrog has come. Gimli stared with wide eyes. Durin's bane, he cried. And letting his axe fall, he covered his face. By the way, I love this reaction. A Balrog, muttered Gandalf. Now I understand. He faltered and leaned heavily on his staff. What an evil fortune. And I am already weary. The dark figure, streaming with fire, raced towards them. The orcs yelled and poured over the stone gangways. Then Boromir raised his horn and blew. Loud the challenge rang and bellowed like the shout of many throats under the cavernous roof. For a moment, the orcs quailed and the fiery shadow halted. Then the echoes died as suddenly as a flame blown out by a dark wind. The enemy advanced again. Over the bridge, cried Gandalf, recalling his strength. Fly! This is a foe beyond any of you. I must hold the narrow way. Fly! Aragorn and Boromir did not heed the command, but still held their ground side by side behind Gandalf at the far end of the bridge. The others halted just within the doorway at the hall's end and turned, unable to leave their leader to face the enemy alone. The Balrog reached the bridge. Gandalf stood in the middle of the span, leaning on the staff of his hand, but with his other hand glamoring, clean, cold, and white. His enemy halted again, facing him, and the shadow about it. It reached out like two vast wings. It raised the whip, and the thongs twined and cracked. Fire came from its nostrils. But Gandalf stood firm. "You cannot pass," he said. The orc stood still, and a dead silence fell. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow." "You cannot pass." The Balrog made no answer. The fire in it seemed to die, but the darkness grew. It stepped forward slowly onto the bridge, and suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall, but still Gandalf could be seen, glimmering from the gloom. He seemed small and altogether alone, gray and bent, like a wizened tree before the onset of a storm. From out of the shadow, a red sword leaped flaming. Glamdring glittered white in answer. There was a ringing clash and a stab of white fire. The Balrog fell back, and its sword flew up in molten fragments. The wizard swayed on the bridge, stepped back a pace, and then again stood still. "You cannot pass," he said. With a bound, the Balrog leaped full upon the bridge. Its whip whirled and hissed. "He cannot stand alone," cried Aragorn suddenly, and ran back along the bridge. "Elendil," he shouted, "I am with you, Gandalf." "Gondor," cried Boromir, and leaped after him. At that moment, Gandalf lifted his staff, and crying aloud, he smote the bridge before him. The staff broke asunder and fell from his hand. A blinding sheet of white flame sprang up. The bridge cracked. Right at the Balrog's feet it broke, and the stone upon which it stood crashed into the gulf, while the rest remained poised, quivering like a tongue of rock thrust out into emptiness. With a terrible cry, the Balrog fell forward, and its shadow plunged down and vanished. But even as it fell, it swung its whip, and the thongs lashed and curled around the wizard's knees, dragging him to the brink. He staggered and fell, grasped vainly at the stone, and slid into the abyss. "Fly, you fools," he cried, and was gone. It's a Balrog, and already I'm weary. Love that line. You talk about Eisenhower stepping aside, right? But Eisenhower stepped up too when it was necessary to do so, and he fought the Balrog when he needed to. Doing what's right instead of what's convenient is the mark of a hero. But heroes, particularly gray ones, and I know on the video you can't see it, but my kids were ragging on me the other day about having gray on the side of my head now. They're like, "Oh, it doesn't wipe off." I'm like, "No, it doesn't." And then they proceeded to run around in Lowe's, up and down the aisles. And I yelled at them to stop, and then said, "That's why I have gray hairs." But the gray hairs of wisdom cause an individual to marshal their power at the point of a spear. And I know Tom knows something about this. You don't marshal your power for all things at one time. But when you need to, at the point of a spear, when there's a Balrog, okay, you cannot pass. This is the line. Now, of course, Ian McKellen did it perfectly, and I'm no Ian McKellen. Ian McKellen did it perfectly.
Awesome. That was awesome. That scene was the best scene in the movie.
It gives me chills just thinking about it, right?
He was awesome.
It's awesome. And that's what you get with a Shakespearean actor like that. My God, like he's going to bring the English character to this sucker, and he's going to take it seriously. And then, of course, he will come back. Again, great line. "Behold, I come back to you now at the turn of the tide." God, I loved that in Jars. Because you're left at the end going, what is happening? What are we doing? We lost the wise old guy. How do we move forward?
Right. Or how do we move forward without him? Because that they felt like they just left a gap, like this gaping wound that could not heal.
Could not heal. And we don't often talk about Gandalf, but let me give a shout out to the old man. Look, age brings wisdom, and we mentioned it in The Hobbit, there's no definitive age given to Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings. In the Silmarillion, he's described as being, along with Saruman and Radagast, those are the other two wizards. He's described as being part of 3 wizards that entered the world at some point in order to guide the affairs of Middle Earth. But but then other places he's described as being somewhere around 800 or 900 years old. As a matter of fact, in the movie, when he's riding out to go get the humans, he tells them to hold. Another great line. He mounts the horse and he goes, "I've lived 300 years of the ages of men, and now I have no time." Another brilliant line. And that's the thing that only an old guy can say, by the way. The old guy who's earned it, by the way. So, oh, by the way, just so that you know, all you young whippersnappers who are listening out there, we're running up and down the aisles at Lowe's. There's always a Balrog. There's always an apocalypse. There's always a trauma. And there's just no getting away from it. So as we close, as we round the corner here, circle, that's right. I defer to the man who has more grays in his beard than I do. Distinguished looking grays, but grays nonetheless. My own personal Gandalf, Tom Libby. So, number one, how hard is it to marshal all your stuff when you're at the end and you're tired? Like, how hard is that? Because it's different at 20 when you have to marshal all your skills, right? Like I'm finding this now out in jiu-jitsu, right? Like if I'm rolling with a 20-year-old, I've got maybe 3 or 4 good bursts in me in a 4-minute stretch, and I have to pace those suckers out. Because if I don't, I'm done. I'm just old. Like that's just how it goes. There's no getting away from it at the physical level, right? But even at the mental and emotional level, how do you marshal all your powers when you're tired and you're just ready to be done?
It's interesting too. Like I never realized how true the statement was until recently. That that adage, I'm not as good as I once was, but I'm as good once as I ever was.
Yeah,
right. That's what you're talking about, right? Like, I can roll around for 4 minutes, and it's that one burst that I'm going to beat the ever living snot out of you because I can, and then I just have to manage the rest of the 3 minutes, right? Like but here's the thing. The one part of that statement that I don't agree with, right? Which is when it talks about being, I'm not as good as I once was, but I'm as good once as I ever was. The problem with that statement is the other 3 minutes that you can manage that they can't. Because to the 20-year-old, that 3 minutes is a constant burst of energy that's haphazard at best. They don't know what they're doing with it. They're basically just trying to overpower you with with youthful energy. But youthful energy that is not guided and led in the right direction is just that. It's just youthful energy that dissipates, right? Mm-hmm. And whereas we don't have to put forth 100% effort physically to get things done emotionally and theoretically, right? Like so we are those guys that say, I see all your energy, and if I can mold and transfer that energy into the right direction, I can accomplish great things because I have the wisdom that you don't, but you have the energy that I don't.
Yep.
It's again, like we were talking about egos, it's the same idea, matching strengths with strengths and weaknesses with weaknesses. And the whole idea of like being able to, that's what Gandalf did, right? He was great once. He didn't need to be great 100 times to win the many battles that happened to get him there. He needed to be great once to win the war, right? Mm-hmm. Like to end that struggle, so to speak. And when we basically do the same thing.
And you see this in the movie too. I mean, there's less of the weariness in the movie, although you do get the sense that he's like in the lead up to it. That's where Jackson put it. In the lead up to it, he's tired. In the book, he has that line. Oh, it's a Balrog. And I was just hearing it's just, all right.
It's like Oh, of course it is.
Of course
Like it's like the Kansas City Chiefs winning the AFC Championship at 3 o'clock game, and then the second game is two teams, and they're going, "Oh, let's go! I want San Francisco to win this because we match up better with them." And then Philly wins, and they go, "Oh, of course it is.
Of course
Of course
it is.
it's Philly." Like,
And thank you.
or whatever, or they,
whatever. Yeah.
or Patrick Mahomes sees the Patriots coming, that one more chance, like in the AFC Championship, and he's like, "Oh God, again with these guys, right?" Like,
Again,
so,
that's what I always said as a Broncos fan. I was like, oh, yeah, well, of course it is. Of course, that's what's hiding behind the door. Of course.
Yeah, right. So, but then you look at it, and but it's the same thing. And then Tom Brady, being the age, the elder statesman, is looking at this, going, "I only have to be great one time. Like,
right.
The rest of my team has youthful energy that I can surround myself with, and I just need to go down that field one time and score a touchdown. Let the defense do the rest. Let the whatever." Right? It's the same principle. All of it's the same principles. And the same thing would be. I was thinking about this as you were reading this, by the way. I was thinking about that generational business where the grandfather, whatever, starts the company, handed it off to the dad, handed it off to the grandson, but the grandfather is still sitting on the board, hanging on because he has nothing else to do. And they're sitting around the board talking about new technology, greatest things, chat GPT, blah, blah, blah. And the grandfather, which, by the way, in this episode is me, going, "But people buy from people. Like, why are you worried about all that stuff? Just go talk to them. Pick up, just ask them what they're looking for. Just talk to them." And everyone going, "Grandpa, relax. You don't know what you're talking about. We're gonna get this latest crazy thing, energy, all this energy. And we're gonna throw a million things in the fire and million blah blah." And the old guy sitting in the back of the room in the business going, "Just talk to them." And then when it comes down to here, and this is the magic of Hollywood, right? Because this happens in the Hollywood in movies all the time, right? Where the big deal will come to the table and the grandfather will close the big deal because he had the opportunity to backdoor, have a conversation with whomever is the running leader of that organization. He backdoors it, finds out what they're actually looking for, and does the like.
He goes and talks to somebody.
He went, "This has to be great one more time."
That's it. It's got to be great one more time. Well,
saves the company.
Two things. Number one, my father used to say, and I didn't really appreciate it until I hit my 40s and then arced over onto the other side. Old age and treachery will beat youth and energy every single time.
Yes.
Old age and treachery. And I didn't really, I understood the old age part, but the treachery part, now I understand the treachery part. I just know more than you, kid.
Yeah.
I just do.
Yeah.
And I came by it honestly. I know things that you don't know. And at a certain point, this is what I tell my kids, or younger folks if I'm mentoring or coaching. At a certain point, you will know more than people who are younger than you. This happens to everybody.
Right.
I'll still know more than you because I'll still be older, but it's fine. And then eventually I'll be dead and I'll still know more than you. So it'll never stop. But so old age and treachery will beat youth and energy. Absolutely a truism. And then the reason why that guy in the family business, and you saw this in the show Succession a little bit, they kind of played
a little bit. Yeah.
But the tragedy of King Lear, we read that with Libby Unger. You should go check out that episode. King Lear, Shakespeare writing about this like now, again, 500 years ago, right? King Lear tried to retire. Basically, he wanted to retire. He's a terrible leader. He wanted to retire, and he wanted to retire and live out his golden years without having to be asked any questions. Now, he handed it off to daughters he shouldn't have handed it off to, and his son-in-laws. That leads to, of course, a bunch of different problems. But in King Lear, you see something that is reflected in real life. So most people don't know this, but Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor, who wanted to basically run Germany into the ground and, go, of course, march against the French and whip their behinds, because that's all the Prussian generals cared about back in the 1880s and 1890s, created a system whereby he could put all of the people who were the elder statesmen in Prussia who would have stopped him into what he called retirement. So he developed the modern retirement system, which was then grafted on to the modern corporate system in America. Retirement is, and my wife cocks her eyebrow at me when I say it, but retirement is not thing. It's just not. You might stop working at the level you were working before, but retirement is not a thing. It's actually a tool that's used to get that old age and treachery out of the boardroom, so that the stupid youthful people can be manipulated a little bit easier because there's no wisdom watching over them.
That's why the average age of our entire Congress is 60 something, right?
Yeah,
it's the average age, because they know how to win those elections. They just know how to win those.
Well, and if Mitch McConnell's freezing up, and if Nancy Pelosi, who's now I heard running again as of this recording, is going to be running again for her congressional seat after being away for 2 years. I guess she got tired of drinking wine and staring at her husband in that house in San Francisco, where she also hired an exorcist. Interestingly enough, there was a small story about that about a year and a half ago. Nancy Pelosi hired an exorcist to get demons out of her home. I thought that was very interesting. And I was witty on Twitter, and I said, well, she shouldn't be confused by the spirits that are in her bottles versus the spirit that might be in her house. You don't want to confuse those two things. Got to be very clear on what you're talking about getting out of your home. But anyway, if the people who are older haven't prepared leadership to follow after them, which also Gandalf was doing in Lord of the Rings, if they haven't prepared leadership to follow afterward, then they have also failed. And so that's the other dynamic that we sometimes forget. Okay, we got to wrap up. I've held you for long enough. You got to go. You got to go do things. You got a spiffy shirt on today. Got a good fashion sense. You'll see this on the recording of the podcast. You won't, the video recording. You won't see it on the audio, obviously. But tell us, Tom, you can close. You can have the last word. How can leaders stay on the leadership path with this big old book and great film, Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring? How can leaders stay on the path with this book?
I mean, that's actually a really good question. I had a hard time thinking about, like, because to your point, with all the egos and all the committee, heroism by committee and all that stuff, I'm thinking the most important thing really is empowerment, right? Mm-hmm. If somebody is willing and interested in doing a job, let them do it. Remove the fear of failure, and then you'll get real results, right? Because if somebody is afraid to fail, meaning if I fail, I lose my job, or even if I fail X number of times, I lose my job. If you remove that fear from them, you'd be amazed at the wonderment that you get out of being a leader, right? Like, you allow people to that freedom of, I'm going to go. Now, again, you can't do that with like sales quotas. You either hit your quota or you don't. But how they get there is a different story, right? I've hired many salespeople, and I've always had a general rule of thumb. You hit your quota, I don't give a rat's patoot what you do. I don't care how many hours you work. I don't care. And I literally had a couple of people challenge me on this and say, so if I hit my quota, I could take the rest of the month off. Go for it. You realize you have another quota next month. So if you think you can take the rest of the month off and still hit your quota next month, go for it. So I had people do it. They'd say, my favorite one, this guy, Dan, my favorite one. So if I can hit my quota in 20 hours a week, you're not going to cut my pay. I'm going to get my full salary, my full commission, and I can work 20 hours a week. And I said, go for it. And he did. And he was amazed at the fact that he was amazed that I did what I said I was going to do. I never gave him a hard time. I never cut his pay. You want to work 20 hours? Now, mind you, I was always encouraging him. Your commissions can be a lot higher if you continue to work past 20 hours. So if you want to really make more money, I was trying to encourage him to work the full 40, but I did not require it. I didn't require it. My requirement of him was his quota. And as long as he hit his quota, I didn't give a rat's patoot how many hours he worked, what days of the week he worked, when his meetings were, because he even challenged me on that. He was like, so I have 100% control over my meetings. So if I don't want to come in 9 to 5 and I want to work 3 in the afternoon till 9 at night, I can do that. And I was like, your quota. All I care about is your quota. You hit it, you control it. You do whatever you want. I don't care. If you don't hit your quota, I'm going to step in and give you guidelines. I'm not suggesting you're going to get fired, but I'm going to then start controlling your day a little bit better. So I gave him the freedom to make his own decisions. He hit his quota all the time. He loved life. He was my best sales guy. Eventually became a manager for me, and ended up, it was really good. It was really good. So I think removing the fear for him, really, truly, and honestly, removing the fear that if he did work only 20 hours a week, that he was going to get fired anyway, it just made him excel. It really gave him opportunity to excel because now he realized he was in 100% control of his own destiny. He could control everything that he had to control as long as he had his quota. So everyone has those numbers, right? Whether it's an administrative person, a salesperson, a finance person, it doesn't matter. They all have that one number they're required to hit, manage, maintain, whatever, in order for the business to operate. If you empower them and you remove the fear, which is what Gandalf did on that bridge, right? He basically, that the whole light thing, he basically, that's why people, I'm standing behind you. I'm behind you. You know why? Because he removed the fear. He removed the fear of failure. And I think that's the biggest one, honestly. I think and I think this book does lend to that a little bit about giving people the opportunity to remove the obstacles for you so you could be successful, give you the help and support when you need it, not when they think you need it, but when you think you need it, when you're asking for it, when you're at the lowest point of the when you're at the lowest point of the journey, you're at the lowest point of whatever you feel like you can manage, then they pick up the help. They don't just jump in, to your point, egos aside. They don't just jump in to jump in. They jump in when necessary and wanted. I think there's a lot of things people can learn from that.
Awesome. And with that, we're out. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players, like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show, as it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.